Last time on Angel Makers, we talked about the baby farmers, the women who took unwanted babies for a small fee, the advertisements in the mainstream newspapers, Amelia Dyer in the white tape, the butterbox babies in their butterbox coffins, the industry that murdered children in plain sight and called itself a service. And when I ended that with a question, I said the baby farmers needed a supply of children, and in America, there was a system that could provide one. Today, we talk about that system. I want you to picture a train platform. New York City, 1880s, a group of children, anywhere from 5 to 30 of them. Some are infants, some are teenagers. They are dressed in new clothes, possibly the nicest clothes they've ever worn. They're holding small bags with everything they own. They do not know where they are going. Nobody told them. The train is heading west, and when it stops in small towns across Indiana, Kansas, Nebraska, Missouri, Texas, strangers will be waiting on a platform, and those strangers will look the children over and choose which ones they want to take home. They called it placing out. They called it charity. They called it a new life. 200,000 children rode those trains between 1854 and 1929. And the word orphan, as you're about to find out, was a lie that they told to make the whole thing easier to swallow. You are listening to Just Killing Time, a true crime, conspiracy, and stories that keep us up night. I am your host, Elizabeth Stanton. This is Angel Makers, Part 2, the Orphan Trains. If you're new here, go back and start with Part 1, but you can absolutely follow along from here. Time killers. I need you to know that where this episode's going, because it's going in places that might be a little closer to home than you expect, literally, because this history did not happen far away from here. It happened here in the Midwest, in Kansas, 2 hours from where I grew up. Let's get into it. To understand the orphan trains, you have to understand New York City in the 1850s, because the city was drowning. Wave after wave of immigrants were pouring through the port, Irish fleeing the famine, Italians fleeing poverty, Jewish families fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe. They arrived with nothing. They crowded into tenements in lower Manhattan that were not designed to hold them, and they worked brutal hours in dangerous factories for wages that barely kept them alive and their children. When the parents got sick or died or simply could not feed every mouth, their children ended up on the streets. According to the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society, its streets were home to an estimated 10,000 to 30,000 children in 1850. Nicknamed street Arabs for their wandering habits, these youngsters moved in gangs for protection and often sold matches, rags, or newspapers to survive. Street Arabs, that's what they called them. Children as young as 5 years old, sleeping under bridges and on sewer grates, selling newspapers and shining shoes, or pickpocketing when they had to. And the city's response? Sweep them into prisons alongside adult criminals, or put them in almhouses, which were essentially poorhouses, with no education, no future, and expectation that they would fend for themselves by age 14. Before we talked about what happened to these children, I want to name what created them. It was not irresponsibility. It was not bad parenting. It was poverty, and it was immigration. It was a city and a country that invited people to come and build a new life and then left them completely without a safety net when that life fell apart. These were not throwaway children. They were the children of people who worked themselves to the bone and still could not outrun the math of survival in 19th century America. In 1853, a 27-year-old Yale-educated minister named Charles Loring Brace walked the streets of Lower Manhattan and was genuinely horrified by what he saw, and to his credit, he decided to do something about it. He founded the Children's Aid Society. He opened the nation's first runaway shelter, the Newsboys Lounging House, where vagrant boys could get food, a roof, and a basic education for a few cents a night. He genuinely believed these children deserved better. And in his diary, quote, he said, "When a child of the street stands before you in rags with a tear-stained face, you cannot easily forget him, and yet you are perplexed with what to do." That is a man who cared, who saw these children and was genuinely moved. And then he made a decision that would affect 200,000 children over the next 75 years. And that decision was complicated. And that is where this story gets dark. Brace believed that poor Catholic immigrants were genetically inferior, deeming them stupid, foreign, and a criminal class, and the scum and refuse of ill-formed civilization. Brace and his fellow reformers were motivated to assist the poor by a combination of pity and loathing. He viewed the children of immigrants as barbarians, a ruffian class that one day would possess the vote, the right to vote. If society did not take steps to reform these vagabond, ignorant, ungoverned children, he warned, America would soon succumb to the mob. Pity and loathing. This is one of the most honest descriptions of charitable racism I have ever read. He pitied these children genuinely. He was also convinced that the immigrant Catholic blood made them genetically inferior and potentially dangerous. And so his solution was not to mix the conditions that created their poverty. His solution was to remove them from their communities, strip them of their religion, their culture, their language, and their families, and make them into good Protestant farm laborers. He called it saving them. History has more of a complicated verdict than that. Before I tell you what happened on those trains, I need to tell you who was on them, because the word orphan is the first lie. The co-founders of the Orphan Train movement claimed that these children were orphaned, abandoned, abused, or homeless, and this was not always the case. They were mostly the children of new immigrants and the children of the poor and destitute families. Less than half the children who rode the trains were in fact orphaned, and as many as 25% had two living parents. Not all children were orphans. Real orphans. They were classified as orphans after they were forcibly removed from their biological families and transported to other states. Some claimed that this practice was a deliberate pattern to intend to break up Catholic families that had immigrated to the United States. 25% had two living parents. Two living parents. They were on that train because their families were poor and because they were immigrants, because a Protestant charity organization had decided that their home was not good enough, and because in 1854 a parent had absolutely no legal recourse to stop it. I want to be very clear here because this matters enormously. The word orphan was a brand. It was a marketing term designed to make an enormous, complicated, morally questionable transfer of children sound like charity. Calling these children orphans made the donors feel good. It made the receiving families feel heroic, and it erased the living parents who had not chosen to give their children away and had no power to get them back. On the day of departure, the children were dressed in new clothes, possibly the first new clothes many of them had ever owned. They were given a small bag, a Bible, and a few sundries, and then they got on the train. According to the University of Colorado, Denver, children who were placed on orphan trains were told to completely forget their past, that it no longer mattered and that it never happened. They were told to tell no one of it with the promisement of punishment if they did. Forget your past. It never happened. Tell no one. These were the children. Some of them were infants, and from the moment they boarded that train, they were told to bury who they were. And in the days before the train arrived at each stop, flyers and newspapers and advertisements were posted around town announcing the arrival of adoptable children, the same way you might advertise a livestock auction or a traveling circus. Some ordered boys, other girls, some preferred light babies, others dark, and the orders were filled out properly, and every new parent was delighted, reported the Daily Independent of Grand Island, Nebraska, in May of 1912. Some preferred light babies, others dark. The orders were filled out properly. I want you to read that again. Hear that again. Children were being pre-ordered by preferred skin color, like a catalog, and the newspaper thought this was delightful enough to report it as a feel-good story, that this world is the world that these children were entering. Others were paraded from the depot into a local playhouse where they were put on stage, thus the origin of the term "up for adoption," according to an exhibit panel from the National Orphan Train Complex. The children took turns giving their names, singing a little ditty, or saying a piece. This is where that term comes from, up for adoption. It literally means up on stage, on a platform, in front of a crowd, performing for the people who would decide whether to take you home. And then the crowd would come forward and inspect them. It was not uncommon for families to physically inspect the children, prodding them, checking their teeth, or feeling their muscles, much like livestock. Babies were the most desirable, and older children, especially those over 14, were difficult to place. The first-hand accounts that are what I can't get out of my head, let me read you a few. Hazel Latimer, an orphan train rider, described her experience at a distribution stop. This was an ordeal that no child should go through. They pulled us and they pushed us and they shoved us. And this old man came up with his mouth that was all stained brown from tobacco. And he said, "Open your mouth." I looked at him and I said, "I want to see your teeth." I opened my mouth and he stuck his finger in my mouth and just rubbed over my teeth and his old dirty hands. I just wanted to bite them, but I didn't. And that's what Hazel Latimer said. Lee Nailing of Atlanta, Texas recalled, "A large farmer stuck his hand into my mouth to see whether my teeth were sound. It was all I could do to resist the urge to bite him." A grown man putting his unwashed hand into a child's mouth to check his teeth like a horse. And Lee Nailing had to stand there, a child alone, hundreds of miles from home, with everything he knew stripped away, and resist the urge to bite. I would have bitten him. I'm not ashamed to say that. Mammy Rose remembered her arrival at the Opera House in Rockport, Missouri, in extraordinary detail. She went on to say, "We went to the Opera House as soon as we arrived, which was about noon. The Opera House was full of people who came to see and take us home with them. All the children sat in rows on the stage. When people were called to come up to the stage and make their choice, there was a real old-looking man who had a long white beard. When Sarah and I saw him, she said, 'I hope I don't go home with him.' And I said the same. He did pick out Sarah, but she started crying and said, 'I won't go without Sammy, my brother.' So another man said, 'I'll take them both.' And the old man took me." She sat in rows on the stage, and adults came up and they chose. And Sarah was crying because she did not want to be separated from her brother. And a stranger stepped in and took them both. And that was luck. That was Mammy Rose getting lucky, because most siblings were not that lucky. Most siblings were split up at those distribution stops and never saw each other again. Think about being a child on that stage, watching your brother or sister get chosen by someone else, watching them walk away, not knowing if you would ever see them again. The Orphan Train movement said this: "A tragic consequence of this system was the separation of siblings. Though many children traveled together with brothers and sisters, families were not required to adopt more than one child. Consequently, siblings were frequently separated, often never reunited." The Washington Post in 1998 said, "Like many children who traveled west with siblings, Lee Nailing and his two brothers each went to different homes." I think about siblings holding on to one another on that train, not knowing where they were going, holding on to each other because this was the only thing they had left, the only person they had left. And then they arrived at a stop and being separated permanently because no rule said anyone had to keep them together. No law protected them. They were placed out and not protected. So, time killers. Because this is where good podcasting matters, not everything about the orphan trains was dark. The National Orphan Train Complex, the museum right here in Concordia, Kansas, estimates that approximately 80% of orphan trained children found decent homes where they were treated fairly. Some of those children found genuine love, and some of them went on from sleeping on sewer grates to having warm beds and enough food, and families who treated them as their own. One little girl wrote back to Charles Loring Brace from her new home. She said, and this was done by PBS American Experience, the Orphan Trains. This is what she said in her letter back to Charles Loring Brace. And the Orphan Train writer wrote, "When I lived in New York, I had no bonnet, and now I have more bonnets than I can wear, and I get no whippings, and I have a father and a mother and brother and sisters here, and they are kinder to me than my own ever were. I think I will never be happier than I am now." And another writer, a loving adoptive father at the train station in Nebraska, was overheard saying to a reporter, "It beats the stork all hollow. We asked for a boy of 18 months with brown hair and blue eyes, and the bills filled to the last specification." Now, that second quote, that father was clearly happy. He loved that baby. And he had just described choosing a human child the way you would order furniture. Brown hair and blue eyes to specification. Both of those things happened. The love was real, and the dehumanization was also real. And I'm not going to pretend one cancels out the other. According to the orphantraindepot.org, some orphan train riders were placed in homes where they were not allowed to attend school and were made to work long and unfair hours doing farm or household chores. In the worst cases, children were abused. We estimated that about 80% of orphan trained children found decent homes where they were treated fairly, but it's also important to remember that about 20% were also placed in less than ideal and sometimes dangerous situations. So 20% of 200,000 children is 40,000 human beings. 40,000 children who were abused, exploited, or effectively enslaved after being taken from everything they knew and put on a train headed west. And the system called itself a success. According to the Minnesota State Board of Corrections and Charities Review, the board pointed out that older children were frequently placed with farmers who expected to profit from their labor. A Southerner claimed that men needing labor, their slaves being set free, took these boys and treated them like slaves. A PBS American Experience documentary about the orphan trains includes this account from a writer about what happened to a boy named Albert. They kept him on the farm, wouldn't send him to school, worked him 18 hours a day in the field, and he just lost his mind. And he died at the early age, less than 30 years of age. And he finally ran away from home, but it was too late. They wouldn't let him go to town and see people, afraid he'd tell them how badly he was treated. And he never saw anybody. I saw him about 2 times during the whole time he was there, about 10 years. I just saw him twice, and he was afraid to talk to me, and I couldn't help him. I didn't know him enough to help him. He was afraid to talk. He was afraid that if he told someone on how he was being treated, he would be punished worse. An 18-hour workday. No school, no town, no contact with other people for 10 years, and he died before he was 30. Albert's name deserves to be said out loud. He was a child who rode that train, hoping for a new life, and he got a different kind of prison than the one he left. I'm so sorry, Albert. You deserved better. Alice Bolus Eiler's story belongs specifically in Kansas, and I want to tell you about it because it connects this history directly to my home. After a year in placement that did not work out, Eiler was transported to Kansas on an orphan train. The stock market crash, which triggered the Great Depression, had occurred the year before, and the drought that would produce the Dust Bowl was beginning. These were some of the worst years of Eiler's life. Too old to be adopted, she was moved from family to family, a hired hand without pay. Alice said, "I was told constantly that I had bad blood. I was always looking at my veins and wondering what could be bad about it. It looked just like everybody else's." A hired hand without pay, a child, moved from family to family across Kansas during the Dust Bowl and the Great Depression. She was told she had bad blood, looking at her veins, wondering what was wrong with her. And Alice later said, and this is a direct quote from the museum, "She was one of the luckier ones because I know my heritage. They took away my identity of most of the younger writers by not allowing contact with the past." They took away the identity of the younger writers. She said that herself. Alice survived. She married her high school sweetheart. She had children. She built a life. And she still carried the word bad blood for the rest of it. Someone said that to a child who was alone in Kansas during the Dust Bowl, who had done nothing wrong, who just needed a family. Bad blood. I want everyone who said that to know that Alice Bullis Iyer was not the one with bad blood. Not even close. Time killers, and especially of those of you that are in Kansas, in Wichita, in Derby, in the surrounding communities, I need you to tell me something. The Orphan Trains, they came here. Kansas was one of the primary destination states for orphan train riders. Children with the streets of New York City were brought to Kansas town, displayed on stages, and distributed to Kansas farm families who needed labor. And right now, 2 hours north of Wichita, in a small town called Concordia, Kansas, there is the only museum in the entire country dedicated entirely to the orphan train movement. The National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia, Kansas is the only museum in the country dedicated entirely to preserving the orphan train story. The museum complex includes the former 1917 Union Pacific Depot, the Morgan Dowell Research Center, a historic passenger train car, and more than 50 statues of children placed throughout the town. And here's the detail that I love and that breaks my heart at the same time. A train carrying children from New York stopped first in Wayne, Kansas. The children who were not chosen in Wayne, the ones nobody wanted at that stop, were taken to the end of the line. And according to Shanley George, curator of the National Orphan Train Complex, the kids who were not chosen in Wayne came to the end of the line in Concordia, and then they were chosen. End of the line, Concordia, Kansas, was the end of line for children nobody else wanted. And let that phrase just settle for a minute, because the children who had already sat on the stage and watched other children get chosen and not been chosen themselves, they rode on to Concordia, which became a town that has been spent a century honoring them. That is something profoundly redemptive about that. Concordia refused to let those children be forgotten. It built a museum. It put statues of them in every corner of the town, and it said, "You mattered. You were not the leftovers. You were the children of Concordia." The Nebraska public media said this: Marie Coate was an infant on a train headed for Nebraska, but when it stopped in Belleville, Kansas, the Francoeur, that's a French word that I'm having a hard time pronouncing, the Francoeur family of Concordia adopted her. Coate lived to be more than 100 years old, but didn't tell her daughters she was an orphan train rider until the museum was established. For most of her life, she kept the bonnet she wore on the train locked in a chest. A bonnet locked in a chest. For most of a century. She lived to be over 100 years old, and she kept that bonnet hidden away like a secret, like a shame. She did not tell her own daughters because the word orphan carried so much weight. Because being a train child meant being somebody nobody wanted. And she carried that in a locked chest, her bonnet, for 100 years until the museum in Concordia said, "Your story matters." And she finally opened that chest. According to the Irish American magazine, so many children were sent to the Midwest that it is estimated 1 in 4 Iowans can trace their ancestry to an orphan train rider. An estimated 2 million Americans are descended from orphan train riders today. There are an estimated 3 million people currently living who are direct descendants of those who rode the orphan trains from 1854 to 1929, according to the Saturday Evening Post. 2 to 3 million Americans descended from children who rode those trains. One of them might be you. One of them might be your neighbor. One might be your great-grandparent whose story was locked in a chest, just like Marie Coates' bonnet. And the museum in Concordia, 300 Washington Street, Concordia, Kansas, is keeping those records. Over 8,000 rider records. A genealogist who fields 250 research requests every single year from people trying to find out who their people were. If you are a Kansas listener and you think you might have orphan train ancestry, go to orphantraindepot.org or go to Concordia and walk through that museum. Walk through the restored train car. Read the statues, because those children came through this state. They became part of this state, and their stories are our history. I know personally that's a museum I am going to go visit soon after researching this podcast. Now, I want to talk about something that was not accidental. Something was not just a side effect of a flawed but well-meaning system. The deliberate erasure of religious and cultural identity. Sorry, I'm sniffling. It's kind of got me all clipped. Charles Loring Brace's Children's Aid Society was a Protestant organization, and the children they were placing out were predominantly Catholic, Irish, Italian, Polish immigrants whose families had brought them their faith across an ocean as one of the few things nobody could take from them, except somebody did take it. The Irish American magazine said in the 1870s, the Catholic Church became concerned that many Catholic children were being sent to Protestant homes and were being inculcated with Protestant values. You know what I'm trying to say. And according to the New England Historical Society, the Reverend George F. Haskins, spokesman for the Bishop of Boston, accused the children's mission of luring Catholic children into the trains to turn them into Protestants. To aid in the work of perversion, societies were formed to receive Catholic children and provide for them till a number shall be collected sufficient to fill a car, when they should be steamed off swiftly to some western state and sold body and soul to farmers and squatters. Body and soul, he called it, selling children body and soul. And the Catholic Church's response was to start its own orphan train program, the New York Foundling Hospital's baby train, specifically to place Catholic children in Catholic homes. Priests in destination towns would announce from the pulpit that children were coming. Parishioners could apply for a child, and they could specify gender and preferred hair and eye color, and the children would arrive. So now we have two parallel systems. A Protestant charity shipping Catholic immigrant children to Protestant homes, and a Catholic institution shipping Catholic children to Catholic farms, both systems using children as vessels for ideological transmission. Both systems deciding that a child's purpose was to carry someone else's religion into the next generation, neither system particularly concerned with what the child wanted or who the child had been before they boarded that train. According to the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society, the children selected for the program were those deemed most likely to be successfully placed in new homes. That meant that they were mostly white and of the same Western European background as prospective Midwestern families. Non-white, disabled, and older children were generally excluded from the movement. Similar charges of conversion via adoption were made concerning the placement of Jewish children. If you were not white enough, you did not get placed. If you were disabled, you did not get placed. If you were too old, over 14, you were nearly impossible to place. The system did not serve all children equally. It served the children who were most useful and most palatable to Protestant Midwestern families. And for the children who did not fit that profile, the ones who were not chosen at Wayne or Concordia or any other stop, the system had very few answers. And now I need to step outside the orphan train story for a moment, because while All of this was happening while Catholic and Protestant organizations were competing to place immigrant children in ideologically correct homes. The United States government was running a parallel system, a darker, more explicit government-sanctioned version of the same machine. According to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, beginning with the Indian Civilization Act Fund of 1819 and the Peace Policy of 1869, the United States adopted an Indian boarding school policy expressly intended to implement cultural genocide through the removal and reprogramming of American Indian and Alaskan Native children to accomplish the systemic destruction of Native cultures and communities. The stated purpose of this policy was to kill the Indian and save the man. The National Native American Boarding School and Healing Coalition went on to say, between 1869 and 1960s, I said, hundreds of thousands of Native American children were removed from their homes and families and placed in boarding schools operated by the federal government and the churches. By 1900, there were 20,000 children in Indian boarding schools, and by 1925, that number had more than tripled. Kill the Indian, save the man. Those were the actual words, a government policy, printed on official documents. The explicit goal was to destroy a culture by taking its children. The children were forbidden to speak their native languages. They were punished for practicing their cultures. They were stripped of their clothing, their hair, and their names. Their names. Notes from the Frontier said the government oversaw institutional removal of Native American children from their parents, tribes, and communities to boarding schools, orphanages, and mission schools to indoctrinate them into white culture. New name, new family, new religion, new culture. Forget the past. It never happened. Tell no one. The orphan train riders were told this. The Native children in boarding schools were told this. The farm babies that had it done to them before they were old enough to understand the same language, the same erasure, the same machine, just different populations being fed into it. And all of it was called charity or civilization or saving, and all of it broke something in the children that was never actually fixed. The orphan train movement ended in 1929, and the reasons tell you as much about the system as the system itself does. The trains began to decline in the face of rising criticism over the lack of oversight and vetting of the placement homes and the changing views on child labor. The need for children to adopt and provide labor declined steeply as rural areas became settled and many states passed laws preventing the importation and placement of out-of-state children within their borders. The need for labor declined. Let me say that again. The need for labor declined. The orphan trains were not shut down primarily because someone decided the system was inhumane. They were shut down in part because the farms no longer needed the labor. The market for child laborers dried up. And states started protecting their own orphan population. Kansas, Indiana, Illinois, Minnesota, Missouri, Nebraska all passed laws requiring bonds before out-of-state children could be placed. And the profession of social work emerged, and the New Deal bought government safety nets, and the child labor laws changed the economics. The strain stopped because the world changed, not primarily because the world decided what had been happening was wrong. The moral reckoning came later, much later, and it is still happening now. In 2024, the National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia received visitors from 46 of the 50 states and 11 countries. People from Azerbaijan and Slovakia came to a small Kansas town to understand what was happening to their ancestors. And that is the size of the shadow this movement cast, and it is still being walked through. I really apologize for butchering anybody's names or countries. So please forgive me on that. Brace's notion that children are better cared for by families than in institutions is the most basic tenet of present-day foster care. While some honor Brace for his compassionate work with the street children of New York City, others believe he was a racist bigot whose destruction of families led to the creation of a racist, classist foster care system that exists today. The Orphan Trains are the direct ancestor of the American foster care system. The same logic. Children are better off in families than in institution. That drives both. The same failures, insufficient oversight, inadequate vetting, not enough follow-up have plagued both. The Orphan Train movement gave us the foster care system, and the foster care system is still failing children today in many of the same ways. The machine has a new name and a new coat of paint, but some of the gears are the same. I'm not saying foster care is bad. I'm not saying that there is not good, loving foster care families doing extraordinary things for children who need them. They absolutely are. What I am saying is that when you look at the systemic failures in modern foster care and the aging out at 18 with no support, unrepresentation of children of color, the insufficient oversight, the cases that fall through the cracks, and that you look at what happened to those orphan train riders and what they experienced, the similarities are not coincidence. They are lineage, and you cannot fix a system without understanding where it all came from. Time killers. Let me pull this thread for you. Last episode, we talked about baby farmers, the nameless babies transferred for money, the new name, the lump sum payment, the receipt that was called an adoption certificate. This episode, the Orphan Trains, children were given new names, new families, new religions, told to forget the past, displayed on stages for selection, new identities assigned by strangers. And in 1978, in Cleveland, Georgia, a young art student set up shop in an old medical clinic and started calling his handmade dolls babies. And he gave them names from real birth records, and he gave them birth certificates. And he set up a hospital and called what you did when you took one home adoption. He was not thinking about orphan trains. He was not thinking about baby farms, almost certainly. But the language he used, the ceremony he created, the nameless baby, the new name, the papers, the oath, the hospital, the adoption, that language did not appear from nowhere. It came from somewhere. It is the language America has been using to process children for 100 years. And we will get there in the final episode of Angel Makers, Born in a Cabbage Patch. We are going to follow that thread all the way to the end. But before we do, there's one more piece of the machine we have not looked at yet. Because the orphan trains needed children. And the baby farmers needed children. And somebody had to remove the parents to make that supply available. Next time on Angel Makers, the asylums, the stolen mothers, the women who were declared insane for reading novels and disagreeing with their husbands and being immigrants and wanting divorces, and the children who were left behind when the locked door closed. That is part 3, and it might be the darkest one yet. Time killers, it is your turn. And this week's Time Killer Files question might be the one I'm most personally excited about. Are you a descendant of an orphan train rider? There are an estimated 2 to 3 million of you in America right now, maybe more. One of you listening to this episode, maybe more than one. Do you have a family story that got hushed up? A great-grandmother who arrived in Kansas on a train and nobody talked about? A name change in the family tree that nobody could explain? An ancestor who appeared in the Midwest records with no family history before a certain date? If you think you might be a descendant, I want you to send you somewhere first. Go to orphantraindepot.org. The National Orphan Train Complex in Concordia, Kansas, holds over 8,000 rider records, and their research center handles 250 requests a year, and they can help find your people. And then send me your time killer file, because this history deserves to be told by the people who carry it in their blood. I also want to hear from anyone with a family connection to the Native American boarding schools. We touched on that story today, and I'm going to continue to research it. And if your family was affected and if you carry that history, I want to hear from you with respect, with care, and with your permission. Put your contact. So if you, wherever you find this podcast, go ahead and contact me, or just contact me at justkillingtimepodcast@gmail.com. 200,000 children, new names, new families, no choice. And somewhere in north central Kansas, in a small town called Concordia, there are more than 50 statues of these children standing in the streets, reading books, playing, just being children, permanent, honored, and named. The children of Concordia, the end of the line, the ones that nobody picked first. They mattered, they always mattered, and now we know their names. Next time, Angel Makers Part 3. The Museum of the Unwanted, the Asylums, the Stolen Mothers, and the Children Left Behind. I am your host, Elizabeth Stanton. This has been Just Killing Time. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for carrying these stories with me. And take care of yourself and take care of each other.
Alexa, what is a chemtrail?
Chemtrail. Trails left by aircraft are actually chemical or biological agents deliberately sprayed at high altitudes for a purpose undisclosed to the general public in clandestine programs directed by government officials.